my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Will that hold? Probably not. Let me put it back here. There used to be just one church where I was so nervous that my mouth got dry. Apparently there are now two. The one church where that happened was my home church, the church I grew up in. So anytime I ever have to appear there, I don't know why. Something about preaching to your pediatrician might do it. Anyway, it's great to be here with you all today. We notice in these 3 lessons this morning a kind of, for our lectionary, a remarkable unity of theme. Often the 3 lessons have many things in common, and they portray Jesus, they portray the love of God, they portray God's purposes in acting in creation and in the world. But today, all 3 carry really a single thread, and that thread is the theme of abundance. Abundance. I am remembering my take on that abundance when I remember a dear friend of mine who is since experiencing God's abundance in heaven. And she would, in spite of very difficult times in her own life, some real health issues, a daughter who was not easy to raise, but then what child is, some financial insecurity in her own life. We were walking down the street one day, and she said, "But I do know this," she said. "In the kingdom of God, there is always enough and more than enough." And she said, when I ally myself with the kingdom of God, that is God's realm that lives inside of this realm where we live, God's truth, God's way of being, God's way of communicating the divine to us, there is always enough and more than enough, even in hardship, even in supposed deprivation, even in suffering. Those were hard words. They were hard words coming from her, but they were truthful words because they showed the abundance of her own life, her own heart, her own faith. So in this morning's lesson from 2 Kings, we have the story of Elisha and a miraculous feeding. At the time of Elisha, there was a great famine in the land when this story appears. And so it is a remarkable story. First of all, so there's a time of a great famine in the land. Elisha is serving in the temple, and a man comes with his first fruits to present them at the temple. Now, that alone, that's according to Jewish law. At the harvest, everyone would bring the first fruits of the harvest, the first fruits of their labor, to the temple, to God, to present them to God, where the priests would offer them up to God, and they would also often be used to sustain the priests and those who served the temple. Now, I think it's a remarkable thing that in a time of famine, this man is faithful enough to bring his first fruits. That alone is a kind of living into God's plenty, trusting God enough to say, boy, this may be all I harvest this year, or there may not be much more, but I'm going to do what I have done my whole life, which is to bring the fruits of my labor to the Lord who gave me the ability to earn those, to raise those fruits, to earn them. That alone. And so Elisha, in this time of famine, Elisha says, okay, we're going to use this not for the temple, but we're going to use this to feed the people because the people were starving. And the man says, this won't feed all those people. This little bit that I brought won't possibly feed all those people. And Elisha says, God provides. What we hear over and over again in the scriptures, Elisha says, is God provides. And here you have brought the best you have, and God will provide. And of course, the rest of the story is that God does provide. That small offering of the man's heart, of the man's substance, provides food for all the people with enough left over to feed more. It's an astonishing picture of God's will of abundance, that God can take what we offer and multiply it to feed multitudes. In the letter to the Ephesians today, Paul writes to the Ephesians, and he talks about that you might be fed from the riches of God's grace. From the riches of God's grace. So that the Ephesians will comprehend in their lives the breadth and length and depth and height of God's love. That's Paul's prayer for them, is that even in the midst of their lives, which might be struggling, which might be, the early Christians were often persecuted. They were ridiculed by their friends, by their neighbors, by even members of their own family. But that Paul writes that with the prayer that they will understand that God's riches are available to them in all the breadth and length and depth and height, that no matter how far they fall, no matter where they might wander, God's love, God's riches are there for them. And finally, we have this remarkable gospel from the 6th chapter of John, and it is John. Mark got written. We've been in Mark, and now in the summer we take a little excursus into John. The 6th chapter of John contains a whole lot of stories about the bread of life. And this is the first of these stories. When it's later in John's gospel that Jesus says, I am the bread of life, and I'm come to give my life for the life and health and sustenance of the world. So this is the beginning of the bread of life discourse. All 4 gospels contain this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which is also pretty remarkable. It's the only miracle in all 4 gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke use this story of the feeding of 5,000 to show that Jesus had compassion on the crowd. They show it as a sign of Jesus' identification with the poor and hungry of the world, and indeed Jesus does identify, as we know over and over again in our own lives. But John uses this passage to say as a teaching to the disciples. John says Jesus said this to teach his disciples something about the identity of God and about his own identity. Jesus himself as the bread of life, that in this multiplication of the loaves and fish, Jesus himself takes what is right there available in front of him and shows God's love and favor by multiplying it. It multiplies. When his disciples say, what will this little bit do to feed so many? Jesus, like Elisha says, God will provide. Out of what is at hand, God will give enough and more than enough for what we need. And we know in that story, too, there's not only enough to feed the 5,000, but 12 baskets of leftovers. Again, a sign that from something so small comes bounty, comes plenty, comes enough to sustain. Again, there is remarkable agreement. I love that thread. I was very glad when the luck of the draw gave me these 3 lessons this morning, because I didn't have to work too hard on figuring out what it was the Spirit was trying to say to all of us today. And I guess I'm struck by John's use of this parable, because we are to understand that the disciples of Jesus are to receive from God's abundance, yes, but then are to move from needing and receiving that abundance to sharing it, to proclaiming it, to living out of that abundance in a world which we know is obsessed with scarcity. In a world in which most people are afraid most of the time that there won't be enough, that they have so little that they just have to hang on to it. The disciples of Jesus are to proclaim and live open-handedly, open-heartedly, giving of that abundance that we know. You all may remember, in most cultures, one version of this story exists, but I remember hearing it as a small child, the story of stone soup. Anybody hear it? So the story, I love this story. If I tell it wrong, don't tell me. But I'll try to tell it right. The story of stone soup, as it goes, there is a village that is in the middle of a great famine. And there's great hunger and want everywhere. And this hardship, this deprivation, this famine has caused this village to cause people really to pull apart from one another and to pull each of them into their own homes. Now, they all have a little food maybe, but they're all hiding it because it is the last little bit they have left, and they are worried about losing what they have. Well, one day a stranger comes to town, and the rules of hospitality say that they ought to be feeding this stranger. And they say to him, we're very sorry, sir, but we are in a time of famine, and we have nothing to share with you. Oh, he says, that's all right. I'll just make stone soup. Would someone please bring me a pot of water? And they do. And he puts the pot of water on the fire, and it begins to boil. And he takes a large stone, kind of washes the stone off, and says, I'm going to make my special stone soup for you today. And he puts the stone in the pot of water, and as it boils a while. Soon he tastes the soup, and he pronounces it, oh, this is really quite delicious. I can't wait to share it with you. But it would be better if we had just a little bit of salt. Slowly, somebody sneaks away back to their provisions, and they bring a little bit of salt and put it in the water. Someone else sneaks away and says, well, I've got this little bit of carrot. Maybe that would be good in the soup. Someone else sneaks away and brings a potato. Someone else brings some spices, some herbs from the ground. And slowly, each person goes back to their meager little hidden store that they were keeping to themselves and brings some of their bounty to make a delicious stone soup from which the whole village is fed. There's a story of abundance. We too live in a time when people want to squirrel away what they have for themselves, when the agents of fear and deprivation and want and lack are stirring up in the world, trying to work against the notion that God has given us so much. And the disciples of Jesus must proclaim and live something else. It's our job. It's our blessing. So I'm interested in how do we move from that sense of our own sense of scarcity? Because we all feel it sometimes. We all feel deprivation. We all feel frightened. We all feel as though what we have, our meager resources, will never be enough for us, much less for anyone else. How do we move from needing to receive that abundance and hear it to being able to share it, to being God's abundance, ourselves in a world obsessed with scarcity? Now, I've been listening to Bill's sermons enough, so I now have 3 points. 3 ways that we might move from feeling like we are so needy to living more fully into God's abundance, which is a blessing for us as well as for the world. First of all, I always think of faith is a muscle. It's not a possession that we have, but it's a muscle we exercise. And I think that we move from this sense of scarcity to abundance when we exercise our faith, when we stretch, even when we are down, when we make an effort to go out of our way for someone else, when we use our meager resources to maybe try to feed the world one person at a time, one hungry person at a time. When we make ourselves, sometimes you have to make yourself move from a feeling of scarcity to sharing. And it really can begin with one small action. The great preacher and then Bishop Phillips Brooks, who wrote O Little Town of Bethlehem, among other things. Phillips Brooks once said that we never become stronger in our faith by wishing to be stronger. He said, you must try something so difficult that you can't accomplish it without God's help and the help of other people. You must try something so difficult you can't accomplish it unaided. Now there's a faith stretch. There's a faith muscle exercise. Take on something so difficult that you've got to pray for God's help. That's one way of moving ourselves from scarcity, living into abundance. Second, I always think that when my woes have gotten to me, and there have been times, and I'm feeling overwhelmed by the sadness or struggle in my own life, what God often does is put me alongside someone else who is hurting or struggling or in want. That when we walk alongside someone else and offer our ear, our shoulder, our arm. When two broken people lean on each other, they're both stronger. That is, if one doesn't pull the other one over. But even then, you do get stronger. When we walk alongside the hurting and the lost in love, that if we can come out of ourselves enough to share, to listen, to be present. Often people don't need a lot of help, they just need someone to listen to them and to know that they are not alone in this world. 8 years ago, I suffered a huge and tragic loss when my husband died very suddenly. And I was in a very dark place for a long time. But in that very dark place, and I broke my ankle at the same time, so I was laid up at home in bed. In that very dark place, people just came along beside me. There was one couple who brought a dinner party to my house every week. They would come with dinner and with another two or three people, and just show up. The husband would walk my dog. They would cook dinner, and they would bring, it wasn't forced gaiety, but they would bring company. And those little bits of sustenance, for me, became abundance in a time of great scarcity. People would say, "I am praying for you," which was really good, because right at that time in my life, I couldn't pray for myself. And I needed to ride on the prayers of other people, and I could. Slowly, softly, people just kept walking along beside me in my grief, in my sadness, in my real lostness. It really doesn't take that much. And I experienced abundance, and I believe that God blessed them in that endeavor as well. And we all together moved forward in this human endeavor a little stronger. Our friends in 12-step fellowships say that their own healing from in alcoholism, in addiction, in all kinds of struggles, that healing is not complete until they reach this 12th step, which is having heard and received serenity from following these steps. We told others and reached out to others who might have the same need. They know that their healing and serenity in Alcoholics Anonymous is completed and is not over, but is deepened and is whole when they are able to share that process with other people. Exercise our faith. Walk alongside someone else who is hurting and lost, and walk alongside them in love. And finally, I think we need to get better at telling the stories to ourselves of the times when we've experienced that abundance. I remember that time in my own life as a very dark time, but I cannot also remember it now, because I've told the story enough times, without also remembering the shots of light that came in and that were beautiful and that sustained me in that very difficult time. So we have to get better at telling the stories of the times when there has been enough and more than enough, maybe not all we wanted, but enough and more than enough to be sustained, telling them to ourselves and telling them to one another. Because every time I hear a story of someone who got through a rough time by the grace of God and by often the grace of another Christian, someone else, another companion on the way, my faith is strengthened. And I am caused in my own life to remember that God provides not just enough, but more than enough. So we need, particularly in the Christian community, to get good at telling those stories to encourage one another. This group, this community gives us plenty of opportunity to walk beside someone who is hurting, to strengthen our faith muscles, and also just to tell our own story and to listen to the stories of others. Because, my friends, the world out there is obsessed with scarcity, and they experience mostly scarcity and want and fear. And this world needs a people who believe and know and walk in the knowledge that God's will for each creature, each molecule of creation, God's will is abundance. And if we begin to act on that abundance and live out into that abundance, there will be enough and more than enough. And we will, in that movement, comprehend, and the whole world will see and know the length and breadth and depth and height of God's love, which is all that we can ask or imagine, and beyond. Amen.